everyone! Today we're going to be reading Don't Be Silly, Mr. Twiddle by Enid Blyton. But before we start, I'd like to give a shout out to my good friend Johnny, and I'd like to say that he is very good at karate indeed. Thank you very much for sparring with me at today's karate lesson, Johnny. Chapter 12, Mr. Twiddle's Meat Pie. My sister Harriet has asked us to go and see her tomorrow, Twiddle dear, said Mrs. Twiddle. Won't that be nice? Twiddle didn't think it would be at all nice. He didn't like Harriet. She was always remembering silly things he had done and reminding him of them. It wouldn't be so bad if Harriet did silly things herself. But then he could do some remembering too. But she never did anything silly. Well, said Twiddle, do you think we ought to go when food is so expensive? We shall have dinner there, you know. How nice of you to think of such a thing, said Mrs. Twiddle, pleased. Quite right, the food is expensive just now, so you can go out this afternoon and buy a meat pie from the cookie shop. You won't have to stand in the queue for more than an hour, I should think. Twiddle wished he hadn't said anything about food or dinner. Now he would have to take a basket, go out in the rain, and hope the meat pies wouldn't be all sold out by the time he got his turn. But he had to go. Put on your mac and your galoshes, said Mrs. Twiddle, and take an umbrella. And remember to put it up, Twiddle. Last time you went out in the rain with your umbrella, you forgot to put it up. All right, said Mr. Twiddle. He put on his mac and his galoshes and then took his umbrella and the basket and out he walked. He didn't have to stand very long in the queue after all, and he got a fine big meat pie, piping hot and smelling most delicious. He felt quite pleased with himself. When he got home, Mrs. Twiddle, who was upstairs, shouted down to him, "Stand your umbrella in the porch outside to dry, put your galoshes in the boot cupboard, and put the meat pie in the larder." Well, Mr. Twiddle put all the things away, but unfortunately he made a little mistake. He stood his umbrella in the porch outside all right, but he was rather dreamy when he took his galoshes off, and he put them in the shelf in the larder instead of the boot cupboard. Then he put the meat pie into the boot cupboard and shut the door. He whistled a little tune, went up into the kitchen, sat down and took up the newspaper. Now perhaps he should take a little rest. Mrs. Twiddle hurried down, poked the fire, found her knitting, sat down too. She chattered away to Twiddle, who said, now and then, and went on reading his newspaper. The cat came into the kitchen and mewed. "What do you want, pussycat?" said Mrs. Twiddle. "Do you want a drink? Twiddle, give the cat some milk." "Doesn't want a drink," said Twiddle, who hated being disturbed by the cat. "It's just mewing. It doesn't want to drink every time it mews." "Give it some milk, Twiddle," said Mrs. Twiddle, and Mr. Twiddle did. The cat drank it. It went out into the hall and smelt round the boot cupboard. It came back and mewed again. It could smell the pie in the cupboard, and it felt astonished and excited. "See if the cat wants to go out of doors, Twiddle," said Mrs. Twiddle. "It doesn't," said Twiddle. "It's just being a nuisance. Go away, puss. I want to read my paper." "Let the cat out, Twiddle," said Mrs. Twiddle. But Mr. Twiddle did. But it came in again almost at once, jumping through the window very near to Twiddle's head. It made him jump, and he was annoyed by the cat. "Can't you make up your mind what you want?" he said to it fiercely. "You don't seem to know if you're coming or going. Sit down and wash yourself." The cat didn't. It gave Twiddle a rude stare and then went into the hall again. It smelt round the boot cupboard, feeling more excited. Either there was a boot that smelled exactly like meat pie, or there was a meat pie inside. The cat couldn't open the cupboard, but it tried to, scraping away at the edge with its claws. Mrs. Twiddle heard it. She wondered what the cat wanted. Perhaps there was a mouse in the hall. "Twiddle," she said, "see what the cat wants, will you? It's making such a noise out there." "It doesn't want anything," said Twiddle, annoyed. "It's just being tiresome. It often is." "Go and see what the cat wants," said Mrs. Twiddle, and Mr. Twiddle went. He watched the cat nosing round the boot cupboard. He saw a fine way of getting rid of the cat for the whole afternoon. He'd shut it in the boot cupboard and let it sniff around for mice there and be happy. So Mr. Twiddle opened the cupboard door, shut the cat in quickly, and closed the door again. Then he went back to his chair and took up the newspaper. The cat soon found the pie. It was still in its paper bag, so it had to tear the paper open. It pulled the pie around among the boots and had a glorious time. Mrs. Twiddle was surprised to hear it making such a noise in the cupboard. "What can the cat be doing?" she said. Said Mr. Twiddle, not taking any notice. "It seems to be tearing paper," said Mrs. Twiddle. "Let it," said Twiddle, annoyed. The cat lost a bit of pie down a boot and scrabbled after it. "Good gracious, you haven't shut the poor cat in the boot cupboard, have you?" said Mrs. Twiddle. "Hunting for mice, I expect," said Twiddle, feeling that at any moment he would have to get up again and let the cat out. "That reminds me," said Mrs. Twiddle. "What sort of meat pie did you get? Was it nice and fresh? Was it a nice big one?" "A beauty." "I think I'll have a look at it," said Mrs. Twiddle. If it's on the small side, we better take a pound of sausages with us." "I tell you, it's a nice big one," said Twiddle in alarm, thinking that now he would be told to go out and buy sausages. Mrs. Twiddle got up and went to the larder. She opened the door, and the very first thing she saw was a pair of dirty galoshes standing on the shelf. She gave a little squeal. "Ah, gracious, what's this?" "What's what?" said Twiddle. "This!" said Mrs. Twiddle indignantly, and she held up the galoshes. "On my clean shelf? In my clean larder? What do you mean by it, Twiddle? Have you gone mad?" Twiddle stared at the galoshes. He must have put them without thinking. Sorry," he said. It was a mistake." "I should think it was," said Mrs. Twiddle, throwing the galoshes on the floor. "Now, where's that meat pie? I can't see it." No meat pie was there. Mrs. Twiddle turned to Twiddle and scolded him. "Where did you put the pie? Didn't I tell you to put it here? Have you taken it to the bedroom? Have you left it in the porch?" Mr. Twiddle couldn't remember. "I'll go and look," he said. Mrs. Twiddle pointed to his galoshes. "Put them in the boot cupboard as you go by," she said. Twiddle picked them up. He went to the boot cupboard and opened it. A cat shot out of there at once, looking remarkably fat. A curious smell came from the cupboard, rather tasty and rich. Mr. Twiddle smelt it, and a peculiar look came over his face. He must have put the meat pie into the boot cupboard instead of his galoshes, and he had shut the cat in there too, so there wouldn't be any meat pie left. It was all very tiresome. What could he do about it? "Have you found that meat pie yet?" called Mrs. Twiddle. "I can't see it anywhere." "Well, dear," said Mr. Twiddle, going into the kitchen, trying to smile. "Well, dear, it's like this, you see. Well, what I did was... It's very funny, really." Mrs. Twiddle looked at him and a cold stare came over her face. "What have you done now, Twiddle? Don't tell me you put the meat pie into the boot cupboard and shut the cat in there too." "Well, I won't tell you if you'd rather I didn't," said Twiddle, backing out of the kitchen. "But I must have done something like that. Quite by mistake, of course. And how it was... I got the cat smelling the pie. Well, I'll go out and get another." He went out, but he didn't get another because they were all sold out. Mrs. Twiddle was really cross. "Now we shan't be able to go and see Harriet," she said. "I'm not going unless I take something with me, and they don't make meat pies tomorrow. We can't go. What a pity." "Well," thought Twiddle, sitting down in his chair and picking up the newspaper again. "That's a bit of good luck anyway. Shan't see Harriet tomorrow after all. That is a bit of good luck, and it looks as if I'll be able to read my paper in peace now." The cat came into the kitchen mewing. "Poor creature," said Mrs. Twiddle. "Oh, that meat pie has made it feel ill. Nurse it a bit, Twiddle. I'll go get a tea, but mind it isn't ill all over you." The cat jumped up on Twiddle's knee. He looked at it in disgust, always going in and jumping out and up and down, never still for a moment. As soon as Mrs. Twiddle went out of the room, he pushed it off and flapped it away with his paper. Mr. Twiddle hissed at it. Go away, I'll shut you into the boot cupboard again if you're not careful, without a meat pie this time. Thank you for reading. It was me, Mira. Until next time, goodbye.